Like the video, subscribe, and comment your country below so I know who's listening tonight. Turn off the lights and put on headphones for the full horror experience. Let's begin the nightmare. If you're brave enough. I have always measured my life in miles driven after midnight, in the empty hours when the rest of the world powers down and the roads feel like they belong to someone else, because sleep never came easily to me and productivity only ever arrived once the sun was gone. So nights blurred together in a routine of glowing screens, caffeine, and the low mechanical hum of my laptop fan until hunger would creep in suddenly and violently, forcing me to leave the safety of my room and drive out into the dark. And in the rural nothing town where I lived there was only one place that ever answered that call, a quick check just off a stretch of highway that barely deserved the name, a road that locals treated like a shortcut and outsiders never touched, especially not after midnight when the trees closed in and the world felt hollow, and even though the store was a reckless 25 minutes away if I was speeding, which I usually was, it might as well have been next door because everything else shut down by 10 and stayed dead until morning, and I'd been there enough times in those late hours that I like to believe I blended in, generic, forgettable, another tired face passing through under fluorescent lights, even if the same night shift workers probably recognized me by now. And on the night everything changed, I'd been coding deep into the early morning, locked into that rare flow state where thoughts align and time dissolves, until around 2 a.m. my stomach flipped from silent to unbearable, and I shut everything down and drove out into the dark, the road empty, the ride uneventful, the quick check glowing ahead like a ship at sea, and inside it was the same as always, humming refrigerators, buzzing lights, a handful of aisles packed too tightly together. So I ordered a sandwich and paced while I waited because sitting still has never been my strength, my mind jittery, my body restless. And that's when I noticed something that didn't fit, something so strange. My brain tried to discard it at first, a person sitting on the floor at the end of an aisle near the refrigerators, cross-legged, facing the glass doors like he was studying the drinks inside, and I remember thinking how wrong it looked, how out of place it was, but exhaustion and habit made me keep walking until a second later when the image replayed in my mind and I snapped my head back around to check, only to see that he was still there, unmoving, a brown coat draped around him, jeans bunched at the knees, and curiosity mixed with unease pushed me to get a better look because I couldn't see his face from where I stood. So I drifted down a few aisles pretending to browse snacks, telling myself not to stare because staring at strangers is rude, because nothing good ever comes from drawing attention at 2 in the morning, and my plan was simple, turn the corner quickly, get a glimpse and move on before he noticed. But the moment I stepped into view, he whipped his head around. So fast my body froze, the suddenness of it erasing every thought from my mind, and when our eyes locked I felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature, because his eyes were wide in a way that felt unnatural, pupils blown, whites showing all around. His lip trembling like he was shivering despite the warmth of the store and the jacket wrapped around him. His posture twisted and strained like sitting hurt him. And the worst part wasn't that he was clearly on something. Wasn't there? Sitting on the floor or the twitching. It was the expression, or lack of one, a blank, lifeless stare that made it feel like I was looking at someone who wasn't fully there anymore, like whatever should have been behind his eyes had already checked out, and we stood like that for what felt like far too long, the hum of the refrigerators suddenly deafening, until I finally looked away and retreated up an aisle, heart pounding, adrenaline spiking, suddenly very aware of how empty the store felt. And when I reached the counter my food still wasn't ready, so I stood there waiting, my body angled toward the corner where he'd been sitting, half expecting him to emerge at any second, to hear footsteps, to feel that stare again. But nothing happened. The minutes dragged, my anxiety climbed, and when the sandwich was finally handed to me I didn't hesitate. I paid and left immediately, pushing the door open into the cool night air and convincing myself that it was over, that weird people exist everywhere, and this was just another uncomfortable encounter to file away and forget. But as I pulled out of the lot and turned back toward the highway, something moved in the corner of my eye, and when I glanced back toward the store I saw a figure sprinting full speed from the entrance across the parking lot, a brown coat flashing under the lights, and even before my brain caught up I knew it was him. watched as he jumped into a truck parked at the far end, the engine roaring to life, and a cold knot formed in my stomach as I passed the store and saw him peel out behind me, and I told myself it meant nothing, that he was just leaving like anyone else, but the feeling followed me as the fluorescent lights faded behind me and the road returned to darkness, that sense that something had shifted, that the empty highway no longer felt neutral but expectant, like it was holding its breath, and for the first few minutes I drove alone, the familiar comfort of being the only car on the road settling in, until headlights appeared in my rearview mirror, distant at first, then closer, closing the gap faster than they should have been, and my first thought was police, instinctively easing off the gas, bracing for flashing lights that never came, because as the vehicle pulled closer I recognized the shape of a pickup truck, the same height, the same silhouette, certainty crashing into me all at once as panic surged, my foot slamming back onto the accelerator, the truck responding by flashing its lights and laying on the horn, and in that moment the quiet road transformed from empty to hostile, my mind racing through options that all felt wrong, outrun him or pull over and hope he passed, logic telling me my sedan had better speed, fear telling me none of it mattered, the speedometer climbing as the road blurred, my hands gripping the wheel so hard they ached, and even as I swerved into the other lane to let him pass he matched me perfectly, staying locked behind me like a shadow, the headlights filling my mirrors, my chest tight with a kind of fear I'd never felt before, the kind that strips everything down to a single thought, survive, and when I finally slowed with the intention of pulling over, hoping he'd go around, the impact came without warning, the truck slamming into my rear and snapping reality into place. This wasn't intimidation, this wasn't coincidence, this was an attempt to kill me, and as he lined up for another hit instinct took over, my body moving before my mind could catch up, swerving hard and braking at the exact moment he committed, watching in horror as the truck shot past, fishtailed wildly, and spun off the highway into the dark field beyond, and I didn't stop, didn't breathe properly, didn't let my hands relax until I was home. Doors locked, phone pressed to my ear as I told the police everything I could remember, knowing the cameras would show him, knowing they'd probably find him eventually. But even as the adrenaline faded and the days passed, one question stayed lodged in my mind, heavier than the rest, because I still don't know why he chose me, and sometimes at night when the roads are quiet and my sleep refuses to come, I wonder how many times I'd driven those same miles without ever realizing that some people don't wander into the night by accident, they go there looking for someone, and this time, it just happened to be me. Years before the night at the Quick Check, before I understood how thin the line really is between coincidence and intention, I was already spending most of my life on the road, hauling refurbished electronics and custom-built PC parts for a last-mile delivery startup that thought it could beat Amazon by doing what Amazon wouldn't, which meant long, erratic routes through places most drivers avoided entirely. And I didn't mind it at the time because I grew up in a family that treated road trips like a way of life, but that job taught me something important very quickly, that isolation isn't just quiet, it's permissive, it gives people space to become whatever they already are, and one night in the summer of 2022 I was deep into the final leg of a Phoenix to Lovington run, the clock hovering just past 1 in the morning as Route 82 cut a thin, dark line through southern New Mexico near the outskirts of Lincoln National Forest, a place that feels swallowed by distance at night, where the road narrows and the world seems to retreat into shadow, and if you've never driven there after midnight it's hard to explain how exposed it makes you feel, because there are no real alternatives, no quick detours, no nearby towns to duck into if something goes wrong, just miles of black asphalt and scrub stretching endlessly in both directions. And I was listening to a true crime podcast to stay alert when I rounded a bend and saw a red hatchback pulled awkwardly onto the gravel shoulder, its hazard lights blinking weakly like a distress signal, and as I slowed down my headlights caught a woman standing beside it, her phone raised over her head like she was trying to summon a signal out of the sky, and every instinct I had told me to keep driving, because nothing good happens on the side of a deserted road at that hour, especially in that part of the state. But then the familiar guilt crept in, the thought of my girlfriend or my sister stranded in the same place and hoping someone would stop, and that internal debate dragged on for just a second longer before another factor tipped the scale. The Glock 43 holstered beneath my steering column. Something I carried quietly and without permission because the routes I ran didn't leave much room for optimism, and telling myself that I wasn't defenseless, that I could handle myself if things got weird. I slowed and cracked the passenger window just enough to speak, and the woman rushed over immediately, tugging at the door handle before realizing it was locked. Her voice jittery and rushed as she said her car had died and she needed a ride to the nearest gas station because she couldn't get anyone on the phone. And there was something off about the way she spoke, a slur that made it sound like she was either drunk or drugged or simply not all there, and I hesitated, watching her through the glass, weighing my options, before unlocking the door and letting her in, the decision already feeling heavier the second she climbed into the seat, muttering a vague thank you without looking at me, and before pulling away I asked the obvious questions. What happened to the car? Did she hit something? Did the engine cut out? But she kept deflecting, repeating that we just needed to drive, her answers looping back on themselves without ever actually explaining anything, and the longer she talked the more the unease grew, a quiet pressure building behind my eyes as I leaned toward kicking her out then and there, but before I could act I glanced back at the shoulder one last time, and that's when the situation snapped fully into focus, because a man stepped out from behind her car like he'd been waiting there the whole time, emerging from the darkness with a casualness that made my blood run cold, and almost simultaneously I saw another figure standing in the road ahead, about 50 feet in front of us, holding something long and dark in his hands, maybe a bat or a pipe, I couldn't tell, but I didn't need to, because the trap was suddenly obvious, the stranded car, the distressed woman, the blocked road, all of it snapping together into a single, horrifying picture. An adrenaline slammed through me as I turned my eyes forward and floored it, the engine roaring as we shot past the man in the road, the woman spinning in her seat to look back and immediately starting to yell, her voice sharp and panicked now, and as she did she reached down and started digging frantically through her purse, and I didn't need imagination to tell me what she was looking for, so before things could escalate I shouted for her to freeze and drew my gun, not pointing it at her but resting it visibly on the steering wheel, and the effect was instant. Whatever she'd been reaching for stayed buried, her hands freezing mid-motion, her voice cutting off like a switch had been flipped, and the cab filled with a heavy, suffocating silence as she stared straight ahead with an expression I couldn't read. Not fear exactly, not anger either, just calculation, and we drove like that for nearly half an hour, the longest 30 minutes of my life, every mile stretching painfully as I watched the road and the mirrors, expecting headlights to appear behind us at any second, until the lights of Artesia finally broke the darkness and I pulled into a gas station with two big rigs parked out front, and I told her to get out, my voice flat and final, and when she refused at first, mumbling some excuse I don't even remember, something inside me snapped and I leaned across her, yanked the door open, and forced her out onto the pavement, where she stumbled and fell, yelling something incomprehensible as a trucker started jogging toward us, drawn by the noise, and I could already picture the scene from his perspective. A man throwing a woman out of his car in the middle of the night, accusations forming before questions. And I didn't wait for any of it. I shouted a warning about her intentions, jumped back into my truck and peeled out of the lot, leaving confusion and anger in my wake, and later, at another gas station miles away, I checked the passenger seat and found the proof I hadn't wanted but had expected all along. A burner phone battery and a sealed pack of zip ties buried between the cushions, items that don't belong to stranded motorists, items that exist for one purpose only. And I threw them away and got back on the road, never reporting what happened, not to the police, not to my company, because I didn't want to explain the gun or the force or the decisions I'd made under pressure. But ever since that night I've paid closer attention to the stories people tell on the roadside, because some breakdowns are accidents, and some are invitations, and the difference only becomes clear once you're already inside the car. The third time it happened wasn't on some forgotten back road or deep in the desert, and that's what made it harder to rationalize afterward, because it took place in the middle of a long cross-country drive, the kind of trip people romanticize, maps traced with excitement and playlists chosen carefully. my husband and I cutting from Utah toward Georgia along a route that wasn't the most efficient but passed through places he'd always wanted to see, and the trade-off for those detours was long. Desolate stretches of highway where civilization thinned out until it felt theoretical, and by the time we hit western Kansas along U.S. Route 400 it was just farmland stretching endlessly into darkness, 100 miles of nothing but open fields and the occasional distant light that might have been a farmhouse or might have been nothing at all. And after driving most of the day I fell asleep in the passenger seat around sunset, the steady motion of the car pulling me under the way it always did. Hours slipping by unnoticed until I woke to the sensation of slowing down and realized we were pulling into a tiny gas station just off the highway, the kind of place that looks temporary even though it's been there for decades, and my husband said he was going to fill the tank and grab snacks, and I figured it was my last chance for a real bathroom for a while, so I got out and headed inside without my phone or purse because I didn't expect to be more than a minute or two, the bell over the door chiming softly as I stepped into the dimly lit store where an older cashier stood behind the counter barely acknowledging my presence, and the restrooms were tucked down a narrow hallway toward the back, the kind of hallway that feels too long for the size of the building. And as I opened the women's room door I almost collided with a woman coming out of one of the stalls, which wouldn't have meant anything on its own if not for how wrong she looked. Her gray hair, matted and greasy like it hadn't been washed in weeks, clinging to her scalp in uneven clumps, her feet wrapped in foam flip-flops that made a soft, wet slapping sound with each step, and the coat she was wearing stopped me short, thick and bulky with strange purple and green patterns, completely inappropriate for a Kansas summer night that was still hovering around 80 degrees, and she was holding a Tide plastic grocery bag in one hand, knuckles white around the handle, and when she saw me she didn't move aside or say excuse me, she just stared, eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that felt rehearsed, expectant, like she was waiting for me to say the right line in a script only she knew, and I didn't know what that line was, so I just gave a small nod and tried to step around her. But she moved slowly, deliberately, not quite blocking me but not really letting me pass either, and when I finally slipped by and headed toward the sink area she turned and followed me, stopping a few feet away, not turning on the water, not checking her reflection, not doing anything a person normally does in a bathroom, just standing there with her arms at her sides, that same fixed stare boring into me, and the unease I'd felt outside sharpened into something colder. Something that told me I was suddenly very aware of how alone I was, so I ducked into the nearest stall and locked it, the click of the latch sounding much too loud in the small room, and the moment I sat down the regret hit me hard. Because I'd left my phone in the car, left my only easy way to reach my husband if something went wrong, and I sat there in silence listening, heart pounding, every sound magnified, waiting for her to leave, and after what felt like an eternity I heard the slap of her flip-flops moving toward the door and the unmistakable sound of it opening and then slamming shut, relief washing over me in a shaky wave, but it didn't last, because a second later I realized I could still hear breathing, not mine, slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere near the entrance, and the realization crept in piece by piece that she had faked leaving, that she'd opened and closed the door to make it sound convincing. But she was still there, standing silently just out of my line of sight, close enough that I could hear the air moving in and out of her lungs, and I didn't move, didn't even shift my weight, terrified that the slightest sound would give me away, my thoughts spiraling into every possible explanation and none of them good, and then, just as suddenly, the door opened and closed again, the breathing stopping at the same time, and relief surged through me again, weaker now, tainted by doubt, and I waited, counting seconds in my head, telling myself she was gone, that I was being paranoid, and just as I reached for the latch there was a sudden, sharp gasp like someone taking their first breath after being underwater, followed by the door opening and closing again, and something inside me broke at that sound, because it meant she'd done it twice, meant she'd been standing there the whole time, holding her breath, listening to me, playing a game I didn't understand, and I sat frozen, fear pressing down on my chest until it was hard to breathe, and when I finally couldn't take it anymore I unlocked the stall as quietly as I could and stepped out, bracing myself to see her right there, but the bathroom was empty, silent, ordinary, and my legs felt weak as I washed my hands as fast as possible and left the room, scanning the store for any sign of her. And when I reached the front, a large man was checking out at the counter, his presence grounding in a way I hadn't expected, so I waited until he finished and walked out before following close behind him, using him as unintentional cover. And the moment I stepped outside, any hope that I'd imagined the whole thing evaporated, because she was there, standing off to the side of the entrance, partially hidden by the wall, glaring at me with open hostility now, her body slightly crouched, something dark clenched in her hand that caught the light just enough to make my stomach drop, because it looked like a knife, and for a split second I was sure she was going to rush me, that I'd have to scream or run or fight. But instead she turned sharply and walked around the side of the building toward the back, disappearing from view. And I didn't wait to see what she would do next. I ran to the car and climbed in, locking the doors as my husband looked at me in confusion, and I told him I'd explain once we were on the road. And as we pulled away, I looked back and saw her standing at the edge of the building watching us leave, that thick coat hanging off her frame, that plastic bag still in her hand. And even now, years later, the part that unsettles me most isn't the fear I felt in that bathroom. It's the certainty that if I'd brought my phone, if I'd stayed in the stall a little longer, or if that other customer hadn't walked out when he did, the story would have ended very differently. The fourth time taught me that even places designed for rest can turn predatory after dark, that the illusion of safety built into signs and lighting and concrete can dissolve the moment you realize someone else is watching you use it. Because in 2020, when I was 24 and working for a small logistics company hauling automotive parts between Midwestern cities, the job had already trained me to accept exhaustion as normal, long drives at odd hours, the steady white noise of tires on asphalt, and that night in mid-January the cold felt sharp enough to cut, the kind of cold where the dashboard lights seem too bright and your breath fogs the air inside the cab if you turn the heat down even slightly. And I was driving east along I-80 from Des Moines toward Davenport, a 3.5-hour run I'd made before without incident, leaving around 8 p.m. and settling into the rhythm of the highway as the world outside the windshield collapsed into darkness. And by 10:30, the drowsiness hit hard, my eyelids heavy, focus slipping in and out in a way that scared me more than any bad neighborhood ever had. So when I saw the blue rest area sign ahead, I took it as a necessary stop, convincing myself I just needed a few minutes to stretch, wash my face, and grab a drink from the vending machine, and the rest stop looked empty as I pulled in. A small brick building surrounded by dim streetlights and a dozen parking spaces. Only one other vehicle there, an old white cargo van parked far off at the edge of the lot, lights off, windows dark, and something about the distance between it and the building made me uneasy, like it was positioned deliberately. But I ignored that feeling and parked under a light, locked my truck, and headed inside, the men's room smelling faintly of disinfectant and mildew, the heater rattling unevenly as I splashed cold water on my face and leaned toward the mirror. And that's when I thought I heard the door open behind me, the soft creak of hinges cutting through the hum of the heater, and when I turned there was no one there, the room empty and silent, and I stood still for a moment listening, telling myself it was just the wind, just my imagination feeding on fatigue, and I finished up quickly and headed back outside, only to stop short when I noticed the van again, because its headlights were on now, bright and focused, illuminating the lot. But the engine wasn't running, no vibration, no sound, just light, and I couldn't remember hearing it start, a chill settling into my chest as I unlocked my truck and climbed in, starting the engine and pulling away without wasting time. And as I passed the van, its lights shut off abruptly, plunging that corner of the lot back into darkness. And I remember thinking maybe someone had been sleeping inside and accidentally hit the switch, an explanation that felt thin even as I clung to it. And when I merged back onto the highway, I checked my mirrors compulsively, half expecting to see it follow immediately. But for a few minutes there was nothing, just the empty road stretching behind me, and I started to relax, telling myself I was overreacting, until two distant headlights appeared, small at first, then steadily growing larger, and as they closed the gap I recognized the boxy silhouette, the same white van, no logos, no side windows, just a dirty cargo shell. and it caught up to me quickly and settled inches behind my bumper, close enough that the glare filled my mirrors, and I sped up instinctively, pushing past 75, but the van stayed right there, uncomfortably close, and then it switched lanes and pulled up beside me, matching my speed perfectly, and the driver rolled his window halfway down, his face mostly in shadow, just a hint of a cap brim and the outline of a nose visible, and he motioned for me to roll my window down, gesturing urgently, and I shook my head, eyes forward, heart hammering, and then he pointed toward the back of my truck like he was trying to warn me about something.